Hey, I need to close up, so unless you're staying the night, I'm gonna have to run you off. I looked up from one of the dustier old tomes, another history of the early days of Rayffered, and smiled at Susan. She was standing in the doorway, the sun getting low behind the glass in the windows, and the jingling of her keys meant it was time for her to lock up for another day. I put down the book I'd been reading and set the heavy rubber gloves she'd given me on the desk aside. I hadn't learned much, but the trips were still important. I had yet to find out much about the mysterious foresters, other than how to avoid them, but I had discovered a few things that might help me fight them, if it came to that. After the lightning storm, one of my theories had been put to rest, though. The fire was not something that the foresters feared. A couple of days after the fire, we were working in the same spot. We were working near the shell of the house when I noticed that the fire hadn't burnt it to the ground. I had assumed it had been put out by the crew before the foresters got there, but Ramsey told me that the forest walkers had put it out themselves. We hid in the trees when we heard them coming, and they just kind of waded in and beat the fire out. It was something to see, I tell you. Wait, they didn't burn? Ramsey shook his head. Nope, which is weird since some of them have wood parts. They went right in and had it all put out before the rain even started. That made me think. The foresters had to have a weakness of some sort, but if it wasn't fire, then what could it be? Something told me that it had something to do with the deep woods, so I'd been reading anything that Susan's store had about the woods. A lot of people, the loggers especially, had gone into the outskirts of the forest, but very few had gone to the deep woods and come back to talk about it. 2 of them had been sent to the mental hospital after they came out raving. This was about the turn of the century, but one of them still lived in town. Jameson Worthy had celebrated his 70th birthday this year and hadn't said a word for 55 of those 70 years. He had been a logger in the years between the war, and when his outfit had been set upon by the foresters just as dark set, the town had thought they were all lost. They found Jameson the next day, wandering beside the road and mumbling about having seen the deep woods. They took him to the local doctor, a fella named Burke, and when the boy had been brought in, Burke said he had stopped babbling and gone silent. The men who'd found him had gotten very little out of him about the deep woods, and Jameson hadn't said another word about it for the rest of his life. Whatever secrets he had seen in the deep woods would likely stay there. "You okay?" Susan asked, drawing me out of my thoughts as she locked up the shop. "Yeah, just thinking." "About?" she asked, the 2 of us walking down the sidewalk as we left Main Street. "I guess I'm just wondering why no one has ever made a list of people that have gone missing. It would have to be quite a few by this point. I wonder if it would help us understand why the foresters take people." She sighed theatrically. "I swear, Jeff, you're the only person I know that's interested in foresters." She said it with a little giggle. "Well, the second, I guess, if we're being honest." I looked at her questioningly. "The second?" "Well, yeah. Who do you think helped Dad collect all those books? My Uncle Terry is a historian, especially when it comes to town history. He's been studying the foresters for years. I'm surprised you don't remember him." I could have kicked myself for not thinking of it sooner. Susan's uncle was one of the foremost authorities on town history, and he sat on the council for the Heritage Museum, as well as being the acting liaison for the city council in matters that held interest to the museum. His research into the foresters was something I had not known about, and was likely something he didn't talk about often. The foresters were considered a sore subject with the mayor and the sheriff, and people who might be thinking about poking their noses into it were discouraged severely. I'll admit, the last time I was at your house regularly, I wasn't exactly interested in studying history. Susan smiled. I seem to remember it was anatomy you were interested in. I blushed a little. "Yeah, you may be right about that." She grinned. "He's staying at the house if you'd like to see him. He always liked you, so I don't think he would mind talking to you." "Why's your uncle staying with your parents?" I blurted out before I could think better of it. Well, when Aunt Helen died last year of cancer, Uncle Terry fell into a depression. Dad offered to let him stay with us, and, well, you know how Uncle Terry is about his books. Our basement is like a library, and he practically lives down there these days. He does come up for meals, dinner chief among them, if you'd like to stay for dinner. I thought about it, weighing the knowledge gained against the earful I'd get from my mom about being out after dark. I decided it was worth the risk and told her I'd be glad to have dinner with her family. She smiled, and I'd be lying if it was all about seeing our uncle. As much as I tried to play the stoic, I had missed Susan, and the more time I spent at the bookstore, the harder it was not to slip back into old habits. Susan was a lovely girl, someone I would have liked to settle down with, but I had to keep reminding myself that I might not be here much longer to be settled down. She deserves something stable, something that I wouldn't be able to give her. But when she took my hand as we walked to her house, I still felt my heart flutter a little. I'd felt that same flutter when I was 12, and it wasn't a feeling you forgot. Susan's house was the same as it had always been, a 2-story wooden farmhouse with a big backyard and grass that her father seemed to constantly keep a lush and healthy green. The 2 bikes laying on it would surely set him into fits, and her twin brothers came out to grab them when they saw me and ran over. Timothy and Gabe were 13, and they had certainly grown since the last time I'd seen them. The gawky pair of 8-year-olds that I had last seen had grown about a foot, and they would soon be taller than I was. "Jeff!" they both yelled, burying me in a hug as the 2 jostled to see who could get the most of themselves around me. "Are you staying for dinner? Do you want to play tonight? We got Xbox and Call of Duty. You can be the first player if you—" "Easy, boys," Susan said, half laughing as she tried to pry them off. "Jeff's just staying for dinner. He wants to talk to Uncle Terry for a minute, but then he says he has to go home." The boys seemed disappointed, but I just shrugged. My mom will get worried if I stay out too late. They nodded, that making a lot of sense, and they followed us to the porch as they chattered about school and games and sports and 1,000 other things. When they broke off to go put their bikes away, Susan bumped me with her hip and smirked. "You know you'll have to come play now. It'll break their heart otherwise." I nodded. Should I have my mom call your mom and find out when it's best? As if on cue, her mother opened the door and half bellowed for the twins to put their bikes away when she saw Susan and I standing on the porch. Susan's mom had never been what you would call a fan of mine. Susan and I had been close for a long time, and I think she was secretly afraid that I was going to knock her daughter up in high school. Susan had wanted to go to school and have a future, and she was rightfully worried that I was going to take that from her. She wasn't wrong. I would have liked very much to have slept with her daughter in high school, and seeing me now with her daughter's hand in mine was like Scrooge seeing the ghost of Christmas past all over again. "Jeffrey! What a surprise! Susan, you should have told me you had a guest for dinner." "Well, I didn't—" It's my fault, ma'am. I kind of invited myself. I'm sorry if it's an inconvenience." She pursed her lips in that familiar way that she'd always done, and that was all the outward sign I needed to know that I had indeed inconvenienced her. "Not at all. It's an honor to have a war hero at our table." The words practically dripped with sarcasm, but she let me in all the same. Susan's house was a perfect mixture of cozy 80s aesthetic with modern touches. The modern TV in the living room looked out of place beside the overstuffed couches and the walnut paneling they'd had since I was young. The computer in the den was at odds with her roll-top desk and the deep pile carpet. It would have felt disorienting to a younger person, but to me, it was just a comfortable bit of nostalgia. I'd spent a lot of time in this house, and I was nearly as familiar with it as I was my own. After Simon, Susan had become one of my best friends, and I'd gone to her house more than once to simply not be alone. So when she pointed at the basement and told me her uncle was down there, I hardly needed the directions. "I'll distract Mom so you and Unc can have a good talk," she whispered, walking into the kitchen as her mother plated the food for dinner. The basement was one of my favorite rooms in the house, purely for the smell. As the door came open, I was hit by the smell of old paper and the musty aroma of ages. The basement was a single large room with shelves built into the walls. Susan's grandfather had built it when the house was built, and her father had extended it after the house became his. The shelves were a floor-to-ceiling construction, the old wood practically sagging under the weight of all those books. Some were shiny in protective bags, and some were dropping flakes on the ground as they slowly disintegrated. But to me, the room had always been so cool. There was a big round table in the middle. Susan's father had always called it a King Arthur table, and it was covered in books and papers. The wastepaper basket beside it was overflowing with crumpled sheets and spent pens, and hunched up over the table was someone else who had changed drastically in 4 years. Susan's uncle, Terry, had been the youngest of her uncles, barely into his 30s when I'd left for enlistment. He looked like a man pushing 50 now as he sat raggedly over the table, his once neat blonde hair wild and scooped back into a tail. He looked thinner than I remembered him, though he had never been a big guy. The loss of his wife had shrunk him, and I felt bad for him as I came to the foot of the stairs. "I'll be up in a minute, Claire. But when he turned, he blinked as if not understanding what he was seeing. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know we had company. I'm Terry, and you are?" He put out a hand, and I shook it. "It's Jeff. We've actually met before." He thought about it and laughed when it finally came to him. "Jeff, yeah, back from the war. How have you been, son? You seem to have come back in one piece." He offered me a chair, and I took it as I looked at the books he had spread across the desk. All of them were books about the city's history, except for a noticeable entry about chemistry. "What brings you down here to my little hole in the ground?" I started to laugh, thinking he was making a joke, but the cot in the corner kind of proved his statement. "I'm doing some research on town history, and I figured you'd be the best one to help me." He smirked. "Clearly not for a school paper. Are you doing any particular research?" I looked at the stairs, not really wanting anyone to know what I was after. "I'm researching the Foresters." He nodded slowly, and I got the feeling he had been expecting me to say something like that. "And why would you be doing that?" I tried to think of a good reason, but the longer I hesitated, the more he seemed to understand. "I get the feeling this is less for scholarly pursuits and more for practical purposes. Am I close?" My lips came together in a hard line as I thought about it, finally nodding as I decided to trust him. I won't ask you to help, but as if you would have to," Terry said, chuckling a little as he sat back. "I've been waiting for someone with the sand to take it to the Foresters for a while, and that's what you intend to do." "I do," I whispered, not wanting to put that out in the world just yet. "Then you've come to the right place. I've got a wealth of information here, information I don't dare put out in my niece's shop for fear of the wrong people finding it. I've been considering fighting for years, ever since they took a friend of mine when I was in middle school, but up until now, I lacked help." "Surely the other people in town would help you," I said, not believing for a minute that I was the first one to come looking. "Most people in town have lost someone to the Foresters." "They're scared, son. They don't want to rock the boat. The city council, especially the mayor, doesn't want to rock the boat. They want things to stay the way they are, and they're willing to make little sacrifices to keep it that way." "Like my brother," I said, "and your friend." "Exactly." Someone upstairs called for dinner, and Terry got up, his legs sounding like chestnuts as they popped. "How long do you have tonight?" he asked. "I don't have to be back in the woods till Monday, so I suppose I could stay here tonight if I needed to." He nodded. "We'll discuss it after dinner. If you decide you need to go home, I'll drive you. Foresters don't usually bother people in vehicles, not since the 20s at least." As I followed him upstairs, I realized I'd found an ally in all this, maybe even a teacher who could help me make plans. If Terry had been studying for all this time, then he really could be the one I'd been looking for, and as we sat down to eat, Susan's father grinned hugely as he saw me. Her dad and I had always gotten along. I knew it would be the first meal of many that I ate here. I ended up staying that night, but I doubt my father would have been so leading with his questions if he knew where I'd spent it. Susan came down to the basement to see about us, but she eventually went to bed when it was clear that we were doing our own thing. Her uncle and I pored over my notes late into the night. He praised my research work and helped me fill in a few holes that I had in my theory. He hadn't known about the fire, something that surprised him, but he did tell me something that made me think it might not be all about the foresters. The city-run farmers that sit on the outskirts use a particular chemical to combat the wood beetles that live in the area. The compound, like the beetles, appears nowhere else in nature, and I can only assume that they're connected. Meaning, I asked? Meaning that the only place I can imagine they would get this compound is from the deep woods, and I think they're getting it from the foresters. You're still here. Thanks so much for joining us for tonight's spooky tale. If you'd like a little bit more spooky in your life, why not click on one of the videos that appears at the end of our story, or maybe head on over to one of our playlists where you can get your fill of spooky content. If you like your spooky a little more tactile, I've got a new book that's come out. If you'd like your own copy, there's a link below in the description where you can get your own copy of my spooky book. If you like what you see here on the channel and think you might like to support in a more monetized way, then why not come over to Patreon or become a member on YouTube? Speaking of, let's go ahead and thank our members now. Thanks to Civ Garstad and Unicorn Hollow for being our spooky ghost contributors. Thanks to Janet, Lee Kendall, Saikat, Ronda J, Sue Casper, and Valinator for being our spooky skeleton tier contributors. And thanks to Hi Stacy, Winter, Xaronan, Stephanie Carrington, Tyler Parker, Cinnamon Fox, Sarah ASMR42, Grim Reaper, and TomBoiTopUwU for being our Ghostly Reader tier contributors. And a special thanks to Grim Reaper, who appears to have subscribed not just on YouTube, but also on my Patreon. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you, and your support is always appreciated. If you'd like to support the channel, then come on down to Patreon, or become a member on YouTube. Spooky Skeleton tier contributors, that's our $5 tier, get their spooky 12 hours early, at 8:30 a.m. as opposed to 8:30 p.m. My time, of course. And while Ghostly Reading is only a tier that's available on Patreon, you get a signed copy of my book anytime I write one on your doorstep in, hopefully, a timely manner. If you'd like a book, we have many on Amazon. I've got links below if you'd like to follow those. Should get you to my page so you can buy any one of my 8 books I believe we're up to now. I'm sure they'd look really nice on your shelf, and I'll sign them for you if you can find me out in the wild. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.